look at how World War II affected the situation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the previous recording, we ended about how the British were afraid to upset the Arabs at the expense of them forming an alliance with Hitler in the years preceding World War II. We saw that Arab revolt in October of 1937, and the fact that that was around the same time as the situation with Czechoslovakia, and the British simply did not want to have a group of people that could support Hitler down in the Middle East. So they tried to appease the Arabs with the 1939 white paper, which said that Jewish immigration would be limited in Palestine and that the Arabs would have to accept it after a 5-year period. So clearly, with trying to please the Arabs, the Jews had to look elsewhere for support, which they ended up turning to the United States. But even the Arabs didn't really accept this white paper either. They flat out rejected it as well. In fact, the Mufti, which is an Islamic scholar, he's the highest ranking cleric, and in Jerusalem the Mufti fled during the Arab revolt. He went into exile into Europe and actually tried to persuade Hitler in Germany to help him overthrow the British in the Middle East altogether. So by the British trying to please the Arabs, they did not succeed. Plus they also made the Zionists resort their tactics to the United States, which would have a great impact after World War II was over. So let's turn our attention now to World War II itself. And in your book, this is going to be from pages 99 to 101. Obviously, with the outbreak of World War II and Hitler starting to take over most of Western Europe, the Arabs at that point were officially neutral. However, the Jews, it's easy to understand that because of Hitler's philosophy and ideology and policies, that they had to side with the Allies. In fact, there was a group of Jews living in Palestine in those years after World War I that had immigrated there. They actually formed a Jewish legion and tried to fight Hitler in the Middle East. We know that the Italians and the Germans were fighting in North Africa and the Middle East. That was one of the main areas of fighting. We also know that Hitler created the final solution, which was his way to exterminate the Jews of Europe, and this was finalized at the Wannsee Conference back in 1942. And after this point, this was after the Soviets were invaded by the Germans when Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact, and that set the stage for the mass genocide. There had already been genocide taking place against the Jews, but this is basically what set the stage for the huge amounts of concentration camps and mass genocide from those. After World War II was over, it's easy to understand that Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly because they had been so targeted and brutalized and had genocide committed against them during the years of World War II that they needed someplace to go. And even with those immigration restrictions that had been put in place with the White Paper of 1939, still many were wanting to flee to this region just to get safe. There are some very important consequences for not only the Holocaust itself, but also World War II in general, for the 4 groups that you see on the screen here, which is how we're going to end the recording today. For the Zionists, for the United States, for the British, and then for the Arabs. So let's start with looking at the Zionists. Obviously, with the atrocities of Hitler coming to light, even before World War II was over, there was a very strengthened call for the establishment of a Jewish state. These Jews that had been sent into exile from the time of the diaspora, when the Romans were in charge, had been scattered around the world. They desperately wanted to go back to their homeland, and with being targeted for violence like they had been in Europe, which had culminated with the Holocaust, there was just a much stronger call for them to have their own homeland back and to have an official Jewish state in Palestine. Also for the Zionists, there were some differences between 2 of their key leaders. You can see them mentioned at the top of page 100. A man by the name of Chaim Weizmann, which I discussed him in class. He was the scientist who had developed a way to produce acetone to help with machinery and weaponry during World War I, and was influential in the creation of the Balfour Declaration. He, at this point, was the leader of the World Zionist Organization, and he wanted to take a very slow, gradual approach to the creation of a Jewish state. However, there was another gentleman by the name of David Ben-Gurion, who was in charge of what was known as the Jewish Agency. He wanted a more rapid approach and wanted to rely more on U.S. support rather than to try to work things out with the British. So these 2 gentlemen were in agreement on the fact that there needed to be a Jewish state. They just had differences in opinions on how to achieve that. So this would have some influence on how the Zionist direction was going to proceed from this point on. But definitely the key point is that they had a much stronger position to bargain from because of what had happened with the Holocaust. For the United States, there was a dramatic awakening of pro-Zionist support and a much bigger shift in public opinion because of the atrocities being brought to light of what had happened with these concentration camps. When American troops, after Operation Overlord, began to liberate these camps and news reached home about what had been committed there, people were just outraged. Not just American Jews, but Americans in general were stunned by what they had heard about with these news reports. Most of it had not been known up to that point. So there's obviously easy to understand why more people were supportive of a Jewish state in Palestine. Prior to this, the American people preferred to just leave this problem to the British because they were the ones who had created it with what they had said during World War I and then what happened with the mandated territory that was given to them by the League of Nations. But obviously at this point that was going to change dramatically. There was something that happened in May of 1942, which is right in the middle of World War II. There was a conference held at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. And from this conference came what's called the Biltmore Program. It was a conference basically to try to unite all of the pro-Zionist groups in the U.S. There were different groups that were Zionist in nature. They just had different titles, maybe had some different strategies for how to achieve their objectives, just like with Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion. But the goal was to unite all of these groups into a program that they could try to achieve. And so you can see on page 100 again, in the third paragraph down, some of these different groups that tried to come together. Not only were they trying to unite, but they were also trying to create a very strong political lobby, which ended up happening with the 1944 presidential election. Also with this Biltmore program, we tried to open up more Jewish immigration to Palestine, and like I said, this was during the years of World War II itself, so Hitler had not been brought down yet, and those quotas were still in place, so there was a call to try to open up those restrictions, and then eventually to create a Jewish Commonwealth, which is what the Zionists were working for. But this idea of a political lobby was huge. Many Jews had come to the United States in the years after World War I, especially when they saw the British not being very supportive of their program. And many of these Jews that were living here in the United States were influential voters. They voted in huge numbers. So in the 1944 presidential election, both the Democrat and Republican political party platforms supported the idea of the creation of a Jewish state. FDR, under the Democrat platform, advocated this. His successor, Harry Truman, once Roosevelt died, also tried to work for this and make contacts with the British government to ease up on their restrictions. So you can see that in the U.S. domestic politics, the effects of this Zionist push in the United States and the fact that the voters here that were Jewish had a very strong pull in how our country supported this. When Israel was actually created, our country was a huge reason why that happened. The British, on the other hand, during the years of the war, they were worried that all of this Zionist action in the United States could actually split our relationship with them. The British obviously needed American support big time because Hitler had taken control of most of Europe. And even though he had alienated Stalin and Stalin had entered in on the side of the Allies, the British still needed our support with the Operation Overlord, which was that Normandy invasion. And the British were concerned that this growing Zionist agitation and the Zionists being upset at the British would affect our relationship with the British and that we might not be able to pull off Operation Overlord. That, fortunately, did not happen. We were able to pull it off. But after the war, we know from our unit about World War II that the British and the French and other main European countries that had been dominant prior to World War II were bankrupt after the war. And they could not afford to hold on to overseas colonies. Their empires were disintegrating. And so, because the British had the mandate in the Middle East, at some point they were going to have to give it up, mostly due to financial reasons. They could not simply maintain to afford to keep hold of these mandates. Other places that they were going to have to give up included places like India. They just simply could not afford to do so after the war was over, given the huge economic cost. Finally, for the Arabs, and you can see this on 101, that the Arabs in Palestine during the years of World War II were sort of in disarray. Like we had said, in the 1937 Arab revolt, the Mufti, which was that Islamic cleric, the highest ranking one in Jerusalem, he had fled and actually had tried to get Hitler to help him overthrow the British. So the Arabs in this area of the world, in Palestine, during World War II were just sort of in disarray. That there wasn't a whole lot of attention focused on them because of what was happening in the European theater and the Pacific theater of World War II. So pretty much they weren't able to make any strong gains or any type of bargaining chips for their position to remain Arab or to keep Palestine for the Arabs during the years of World War II. So after World War II was over, basically the Zionists had a much bigger bargaining chip because of what had happened during World War II with the genocide of the Jews. They had successfully awakened American support for their movements. They had pretty much shut down the British as far as them being an obstacle to their goals of creating a Jewish state, and they knew that the Arabs weren't in a very strong position to resist them. So the years directly after World War II, when the United Nations was established and it was decided that there should be the creation of a Jewish state, the Jews came into that decision-making process with a much better upper hand than the Arabs and certainly the British, because the British, like I said, just could simply not afford to hold on to their chips anymore. I would encourage you in these pages on the sidebars, it introduces a lot of names of these individuals and who they were, what they were the leaders of. It's important, especially on page 100, to recognize the Yishuv, which are Jews that were living in Palestine before the state of Israel was officially created in 1948. And these people had come in there in the years after World War I when the territory was mandated to the British and there was some immigration allowed. And obviously these would be people that would be very important in the creation of the state of Israel after World War II. So look at these sidebars to see these individuals and to get more information about who they were and how they were involved in this situation with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So in the next recording, we'll be looking at how the UN steps in and the British have to give up their mandate, and the UN recommends this partition plan of Palestine for the Jews and the Arabs, which results in an all-out